The evening Sylvie Hargrove's 48-foot sloop drifted sideways into the end dock at Wren's boatyard on the incoming tide. She had no idea the man standing on that dock watching it happen had cut every board in it by hand, had set every treenail with a mallet he made himself, had laid every frame on a design his grandfather drew in 1962, and that he knew so well he could rebuild it in the dark. She was going to offer him money. She was going to be brisk about it. Because she was tired, and the dock looked old, and the man looked like he belonged to the dock, and she had closed a $340 million acquisition of 14 working marinas that morning, and she was not in the mood to be sorry. What she could not have known, standing on the bow in the August dusk, watching the man on the dock absorb the impact of 3 tons of fiberglass against his hand-built wood, with the particular stillness of someone who is assessing damage and deciding what it will cost to make it right, was that his name was on a plaque at Mystic Seaport that her father had pointed to once and said, "That man is the last person alive who truly understands wooden ships." She had not been back to that boatyard since her father died. She had not seen the plaque again. The dock shuddered once under the hull's pressure, held, and the evening smelled like low tide and sawdust, and the particular saltwood smell of a working boatyard that has been standing in the same place for 60 years. And Thomas Wren looked at the bow of her sloop pressing against his dock and said nothing at all, which was the first thing about him that surprised her. Thomas had been awake since 5. The boatyard opened at first light and closed when the work was done, which was the schedule his grandfather had kept, and his father after him and Thomas after that. A continuity that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the quality of light in the early morning and the way wood responded to temperature, and the fact that the work required a kind of attention that did not leave room for a clock. He had been in the back of the yard since 5:30, fitting the 3rd plank strake on the starboard side of the ketch. The 60-footer that had been framed and planked to the turn of the bilge now, 3 years into what would be a 5-year build, the commission his wife had been managing when she died. He had continued it because stopping felt wrong, and because the man who had commissioned it had been patient in the way of someone who understood what he was asking and was not going to add his grief to Thomas's. And because the ketch itself was a reason to come to the yard before Scout was awake and stand in the half-dark with the smell of fresh-cut white oak and do the work his hands knew how to do. Scout had left for school at 7:40 in her good sneakers, the small drawknife in its canvas pouch on her belt, because it went with her always. The school had agreed, after a careful conversation with Thomas, that it was not a weapon, but a tool, and that a child who could name every wood it had shaped was a child who understood what she was carrying. She was 8, and she walked with her left hand tucked into Thomas's back pocket when they walked together, and she measured everything she stood next to: boats, buildings, dock pilings, kitchen door frames, in a way that looked like distraction and was in fact the highest form of attention she possessed. The drawknife had been her mother's. The handle was worn smooth at the thumb, and Scout's thumb rested in the groove her mother's had made, and the fit was exact. On the kitchen table, under the sugar bowl, was a letter from Hartwell Marine's attorney that Thomas had read 3 times and set down and not yet answered. The letter described an insurance claim dispute involving $190,000 and a policy that Coastal Risk Advisors, the underwriting firm that had issued his marine policy 2 years ago through an intermediary he had trusted, was now contesting on grounds of a maintenance deficiency that had never existed. The claim was for storm damage to the South Dock, damage that had been real and documented and inspected and logged. The deficiency was not real. Thomas knew it was not real. The attorney's letter, arriving 9 days before Hartwell Marine's filing deadline, suggested very little room to prove it. The boatyard was his grandfather's. The land, the shed, the marine railway, the dock, the tools hung on their outlines on the wall of the main shop. All of it had come to Thomas through his father, and through the years Thomas had spent away and come back from. And the $190,000 dispute was attached to a policy that attached to a property that Thomas could not replace. Because waterfront of this kind, a working yard on a natural harbor, grandfathered uses intact, the marine railway, the last functioning one on this stretch of coast, did not come available. He knew this the way he knew wood. He also knew, without yet being able to prove it, that someone else knew it too, and that the insurance dispute had not found him by accident. He had been making the dock repair estimate when the sloop came in on the tide. She had come in sideways because the wind had shifted, and the marina she had been aiming for, the Crestwater facility 3 Coves East, newly acquired and newly his in the sense that her name was now on the deed, was still 20 minutes away, and the current was pushing her broadside, and the boatyard dock was simply there. An obstacle that had become a destination by necessity. She had the helm. She had handled the boat adequately. The impact was not catastrophic. What it was audible, and Thomas heard it from the yard and came to the dock at the particular pace of a man who is not running, but is not walking. And he arrived to find 3 tons of fiberglass pressed against his south dock end, and a woman on the bow who was already composing what she was going to say. He looked at the dock first. He went to one knee and ran his hand along the outermost plank, feeling the compression. He looked at the fastening pattern where the dock met the piling. He stood. The sloop's hull, he could see from where he stood, had sustained a 6-foot scuff along the starboard topside and a cracked rub rail at the bow. Cosmetic, she would want to know that. Rub rails cracked, he said before she spoke. Topside paint scored, 6 feet aft of the bow. Nothing structural. I can have you a repair estimate by morning. Sylvie Hargrove looked at him. She had been preparing to be accommodating, which was a mode she kept for situations where she needed something from someone who had reason not to give it. And he had disarmed the mode before she could deploy it by giving her information she had not asked for. She adjusted. And the dock, she said. South face planking took the load. He looked down the dock. 2 boards need replacing. Maybe 3. I'll know more when I pull the fender line clear. She looked at the dock, the aged gray of old-growth timber, the particular surface of wood that has lived outdoors for decades and been maintained rather than replaced, the kind of surface that requires knowing what you are looking at to understand it is not neglect. She looked at it and looked at him. "Send me the bill," she said. "Both bills. Dock and hull." He looked at her steadily. "Dock is my property. I'll handle the dock. You shouldn't have to." "No," he said. "But it's mine." He moved to the dock cleat and began to take a line off the bow. "I'll tie you off. You can call the Crestwater harbormaster for a slip. They're 3 Coves East. They'll come get you." Sylvie watched him tie the bowline with the particular efficiency of someone who has tied 10,000 of them, and who chooses the correct knot, the way a person who knows language chooses the correct word. She watched his hands, and then she looked at the truck cab at the top of the dock ramp, visible through the open door, and she saw the leather roll on the passenger seat, and she stopped. The leather roll was open at one end, and the handles of the tools inside it were visible. 5 caulking irons, hand-forged, the wooden handles darkened with years of use. She knew what they were because she had grown up in her father's marinas, and she had learned the tools the way she learned everything about boats, by watching men who knew more than her, and by refusing to look ignorant. She had not seen a set of caulking irons like that outside of a museum in 11 years. The last pair she remembered were in a photograph. The photograph was on a wall at Mystic Seaport. The wall was in the Charles W. Morgan Restoration exhibit. She looked at the man tying her bowline. "Are those—" she began, and stopped. Thomas looked up. She shook her head once. "Never mind. Thank you for the line." He held her gaze for a beat, then went back to the cleat. Her question had come out before she'd decided to ask it, and the fact that she recognized what she'd seen was more interesting to him than the question itself. He filed it. He returned to the end of the dock. The Crestwater harbor master arrived 40 minutes later. Scout arrived 20 minutes after that, brought by Thomas's neighbor from the bus stop, and she came down the ramp with her sneakers back on and the draw knife on her belt, and found her father replacing a dock plank at the south end, while a woman she didn't know sat on the dock box, watching him work. Scout looked at the woman. "Did you crash into the dock?" she said. Sylvie looked at the child, the copper-bright hair, the canvas pouch on the belt, the quality of attention in the question, which was not an accusation but a straight line to the center of a fact. "I did," Sylvie said. Scout considered this. She sat down on the opposite end of the dock box and opened the canvas pouch and took out the draw knife and turned it over in her hands the way she sometimes did when she was thinking. She looked at Sylvie. "My dad built this dock," she said. "He built it the same way he builds boats, so it would last." She looked at the plank her father was fitting. "He says the thing about wood is that if you do it right the first time, it doesn't ask anything of you for a long time." Sylvie said, "That sounds like wisdom." "It is," Scout said, "without inflation, as a plain fact." She put the draw knife back in the pouch. "He never explains it. I figured it out from watching." She looked at Sylvie with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften the way she pays attention. "Are you staying for dinner?" Sylvie opened her mouth and then closed it. She had no answer for this question in any of the registers she normally carried. She looked at Thomas, who was fitting the plank without looking at either of them. "I don't know," Sylvie said. It was the most honest thing she had said to a stranger in years, and she felt it the moment it came out. "Okay," Scout said, without pressure, and went to sit by her father, and Sylvie sat on the dock box in the evening light, with the smell of low tide and sawdust still in the air, tilted in a way she could not account for. Pierce Dunmore arrived the next morning. He had driven down from the city because the boatyard had appeared in the overnight acquisition summary his assistant compiled. Flagged by the insurance dispute timeline, the 9-day window, the property coordinates, and because Pierce had been watching the 9-day window for 6 months and had not expected Sylvie to be on the property when it closed. He arrived in a Range Rover and a jacket worth more than Thomas's truck, and he walked down the dock ramp with the energy of a man who was arriving to a situation he had already resolved, and he looked at his watch when Thomas appeared at the top of the ramp. Because timing was always the first assertion. "Wren's Boatyard," Pierce said, looking around as though reading a listing. "Sylvie says she put your dock into the hull last night." "Unfortunate," he smiled. "We'll want to start the conversation about the property boundary on the south parcel. Your dock extends past the established easement, which means the damage liability actually runs the other direction." Thomas was holding a mallet. He was not holding it as a prop. He had been using it. "Pierce," Sylvie's voice came from behind Pierce, from the yard office door. She had stayed. She had called her assistant and rearranged 2 meetings, and she had not entirely understood why, except that the boatyard in morning light looked different from the boatyard in evening light, and she had wanted to see both. "I don't remember asking you to come." Pierce checked his watch again. 9 days, Sylvie. The coastal risk dispute needs to resolve before the Crestwater close is certified, and the easement on the south parcel is the mechanism. Thomas set the mallet down on the dock box. Dunmore Holdings, he said. Pierce went still. LLC, Thomas said. Registered in Delaware, November 2021. It holds a controlling interest in Coastal Risk Advisors, the firm that issued my marine policy and then instructed its adjusters to deny the storm damage claim on the basis of a maintenance deficiency that doesn't exist. He picked up a small notebook from the dock box, the kind of field notebook a man uses when he intends the notes to be used. The denial letter cites an inspection signed by a licensed marine surveyor named Gerald Hewitt. Gerald Hewitt retired in 2019. He died in February 2022. He looked up. His voice had not moved. His license number is still active in your firm's system. The signature on my inspection report is not his. I had a handwriting specialist look at it on Monday. I have her report. Pierce looked at Sylvie. Then he looked at his watch for the third time. He did not look at the watch again. The 9 days, Thomas said, gives the coastal risk denial time to stand. The denial gives Hartwell Marine's attorneys grounds to void my policy. A voided policy triggers the acceleration clause on my grandfather's deed of trust. Hartwell Marine's parent entity is Dunmore Holdings. He closed the notebook. The south parcel you're referencing is the one your shell company has been optioning through a broker in increments since March of last year. It's the only piece of the Crestwater acquisition footprint that Hargrove Capital doesn't yet control. It happens to be where my marine railway sits. The morning air moved across the water. A line tapped against a spar somewhere in the yard. If the marine policy voids and the deed accelerates, Thomas said, the parcel goes to auction inside 60 days. You've been the floor bidder in every quiet waterfront auction on this coast for 18 months. He set the field notebook down on the dock box next to the mallet. The SEC has a standing interest in real estate acquisition patterns that run through fabricated insurance disputes. I'd know. I was deposed in 2 of those proceedings, in a different context, and I know the shape of it. Pierce Dunmore straightened his lapel. He looked at Sylvie. She did not look back at him the way she normally looked back at him, which was the way of someone who trusted the infrastructure of the room she was standing in. She looked at him the way she had been looking at things since last evening, precisely, without the usual layer of processing between what she saw and what she concluded. Sylvie, Pierce said. This is a contractor making accusations without go, Sylvie said. It was 4 letters. It carried everything the dock had held last night. Pierce Dunmore checked his watch one final time, and then he stopped, because the watch was the reflex of a man who measured rooms by how much time other people were costing him, and there was nothing left in this room worth measuring. He walked back up the dock ramp and got into the Range Rover, and the sound of the tires on the gravel receded until the yard was quiet again, and when it was quiet, it was the particular quiet of a morning boatyard. Water and birds and the tick of timber adjusting to the warmth, and Sylvie stood in the middle of it and did not speak for a long time. She stood still for the length of time it took Thomas to pick up the mallet and the field notebook and set them both on the correct surfaces, and look at the dock, and then look at the yard, and then look at her. "Come with me," he said. "There's something you should see." She saw it herself first. He had walked her to the back of the yard, to the big shed where the ketch sat in her frames, 60 feet of white oak skeleton that was the most coherent living thing in the yard and also the most clearly unfinished. And Sylvie had stopped at the shed door the way people stop when they walk into a space that is operating at a scale they were not prepared for. She walked the length of the hull without speaking. She put her hand on the stem. She looked at the frame spacing. She looked at the quality of the timber, the way each piece had been selected and fitted and fastened, and she understood, not as a technical matter, but as something older than technical knowledge, the way her father had understood, that she was looking at work of an entirely different kind than she usually encountered in the marinas she acquired. She stopped at the transom. There was a name roughed in pencil on the transom timber, not yet carved, the letters light. Anna, she looked at Thomas. He was standing at the shed door. 3 years, he said. She took the commission notes the week before she died. Client knew. He waited. Sylvie turned back to the transom. She put her fingertips against the penciled letters and then took them away. I want to show you something else, she said. She walked back to the yard office. He followed her. She pulled her phone from her jacket and opened the acquisition file for Crestwater Marina Group. The file her father had assembled before he died. The file she had inherited along with everything else and had been executing against since the probate cleared. She scrolled to the correspondence section. She had never read all of it. There had been too much, and she had been moving too fast, and she had trusted Pierce to manage the structural documentation. She found the letter on the 43rd scroll. It was dated 18 months before her father died. It was addressed to Thomas Wren, at this address, at this boatyard. Her father's handwriting, she knew every letter of it, in the salutation and closing. The body of the letter asked for an assessment. It asked what the boatyard represented, in Thomas's professional opinion, to the future of working wooden vessel culture on the eastern seaboard. It asked whether it was replaceable. Thomas's reply was a single page. Clipped behind it, she read his reply. It said, in language that was plain and specific and entirely without sentiment, "No, it is not replaceable. What is here has taken 60 years to assemble and cannot be reconstructed. If it is lost entirely." Her father had filed this letter. Her father had read this reply. Her father had then built an acquisition strategy whose final piece was this boatyard, and he had not told her what was in the letter. And Pierce had structured the acquisition. And Pierce had known from the beginning, whose boatyard he was engineering the destruction of. She set the phone on the workbench. Thomas was looking at the phone. He looked at it for a long moment. He had not known the letter existed. He had written it and assumed it had been read and had not thought about it again, because he wrote honest assessments and did not revise them and did not track who acted on them. "Your father," he said. Yes, he was quiet. "He believed you," she said. "He filed it. He built the whole acquisition strategy around getting to this parcel last. I think so the deal would have to justify itself before he had to explain to you what was here." She looked at the phone on the workbench. He died before he could explain it. Thomas put both hands flat on the workbench and looked at the letter on the screen and did not speak for a moment. "Pierce knew," he said. "Yes, how long?" "From the beginning," she said. "The letter is in the acquisition file." Pierce managed the acquisition file. She looked at Thomas. "He's been waiting for you to fail." The insurance dispute was the mechanism. He had a buyer lined up, one of his shell companies, and the plan was to let the boatyard go to auction before I ever understood what I was looking at. The boatyard was quiet around them. The ketch frame in the back shed, the marine railway at the waterline, the dock at the south end with its 2 new planks still pale against the weathered gray of the rest. "What do you need from me?" Thomas said. Sylvie picked up her phone. She opened her attorney's contact. Then she stopped and looked at him. "I need to know," she said, "if you'll let me fix it." "The dock," he said, "fixes itself. Good wood always does, if you give it time." She understood he was not talking about the dock. She was quiet for a moment. Then she made the call. She made 3 calls that afternoon from the yard office, her attorney, the Marine Underwriting Board, and the SEC Contractor Division. The SEC call she placed using the field notebook Thomas had left on the dock box. She asked him, and he gave it to her without comment, and she read the documentation into the record herself, because the voice on the other end of that call needed to be hers. The coastal risk policy denial was suspended by the Underwriting Board pending investigation on a Thursday. Dunmore Holdings was flagged by the SEC on the following Monday. Pierce Dunmore received the formal notice at his office at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, and his assistant later told Sylvie's attorney that he had read it, and then checked his watch, and then set the watch on his desk, and not picked it up again. He resigned from Hargrove Capital's counsel roster that afternoon by email. 3 sentences, no explanation. His office was cleared by Wednesday. The Hartwell Marine filing deadline passed without a filing, because Hartwell Marine's parent company was Dunmore Holdings, and Dunmore Holdings was no longer in a position to file anything requiring a signature Pierce Dunmore was willing to put his name to. The $190,000 claim was honored. The policy remained in force. The boatyard stood. Sylvie went to Mystic Seaport on a Saturday with Scout. Scout had suggested it the way she suggested things, not as a request, but as a fact about where they were going. She had seen Thomas's name on the plaque in a photograph on the yard office wall, and had said, "Is that you?" And he had said yes, and she had said, "Then we should go see it." And he had said, "Maybe." And Scout had written Mystic Seaport in the small notebook she had started keeping, the same red cover as her mother's, and that was that. The plaque was beside the main entrance to the exhibit, brass already greenish at the edges. Scout stood in front of it for a long time, with her hand on the letters of his name, not measuring, reading it into herself. Then she took the drawknife from its pouch and held it beside the plaque for one breath, her mother's tool against her father's name, and put it away and moved into the exhibit without explanation. Sylvie's hand was near Thomas's hand, in the way of 2 people standing together in a room with something large in it. And neither of them moved anywhere, and the exhibit was cool and quiet around them and smelled like old timber. 1 year later, Scout had moved the drawknife to a working position. She was 9 now, and the terms of unsupervised use had been renegotiated after she demonstrated she understood the relationship between the tool's edge and the grain of the wood. She was working on a small model frame in the yard, white oak, 1/4-inch scale, a replica of the Ketch, which was now planked to the sheer and had a launch date on the calendar. 18 months. Thomas had written it there because Scout had asked him to, and it stayed. The name Anna had been carved into the transom by October. Clean incised letters. Scout checked them with the surveying tape every few days, looking for drift. Sylvie came on Thursdays when she could, which was more often than her schedule suggested was sensible. The Crestwater acquisition had been restructured under new counsel. The South parcel had been retained, not acquired, not optioned, not touched. There was a letter in Sylvie's files now, sitting next to her father's letter and Thomas's reply, that she had written herself and addressed to no one. This yard is not for sale, and it never will be. She had written it so it would exist. On one such Thursday, she found Scout on the dock with the model frame and the surveying tape. She sat on the dock box and watched her work, and Scout worked without pausing, and the harbor moved in its small afternoon way. Thomas came out of the shed and set 2 coffees on the dock box and sat beside her. The surveying tape lay between them on the dock planking. Neither of them moved it. The afternoon light came off the water at the angle it comes off water in late summer, and the yard smelled like white oak and salt and 60 years of the same work done correctly. "She's off by a 16th on the port side," Scout said, without looking up. "She would fix it when she was ready." She had learned that from watching. There are things that hold because they were built right the first time, and there are things that almost don't hold at all, because someone who stood to gain from their failing spent years engineering the moment they would break. The difference between those two things is almost never visible until the tide comes in. And the tide always comes in. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needed to hear that the most valuable things are often the ones that look the least like what they are. Subscribe if you want more stories told the way they deserve to be told. And here is the question I need you to sit with. If your father left a letter you never saw, one that said the thing you were about to destroy was irreplaceable, and the man who hid it from you was the same one engineering its destruction, would you burn down everything built around that secret? Or carry it, because his name is still on all of it? Leave your answer below. We read every one.